Okay, hey YouTube. About a month and a half ago, I posted a question to my Facebook, that's facebook.com/loosebricks, asking people for questions for a question and answer video. And then for whatever reason, I didn't get around to making this video until just now. But, here I am. If you want to leave questions for my next video, feel free to leave them in the comment section of this video below. Or I'll probably post another prompt to my Facebook page, which is facebook.com/loosebricks sometime here in the future, and hopefully I will get around to making the video answering those questions a little bit faster than I did for this one. But anyway, moving down the list here, there are 14 questions, and I'm going to try to get to them as quickly as possible so this doesn't end up being a 15-minute video. So here we go. Amber asks, when you started HRT, what were the ups and downs? And I would say that the ups are kind of that the relieving of the anxiety around starting HRT, where I was worried that, is this the right thing? Is something going to go wrong? Are people going to be able to tell? Sort of a lot of paranoia around it. And once you start HRT, all that anxiety goes away. And I think this is what a lot of people call that moment of clarity once they start HRT. And that's, a really big up. And you don't know if that's, mental bandwidth that becomes free because you're no longer anxious, or if that's actually like positive sort of, oh, the hormones coursing through my body are what my body expects to see and needs, and as a result I now feel great about my life. Who knows? But that's definitely the up. And the flip side is the down, is that those are all very powerful emotions, and if you've been in the closet for a while kind of suppressing who you really are, letting all that stuff go and having a new hormone balance means that it's going to be a little bit of a roller coaster ride because you're going through puberty all over again. And while that's not necessarily a down, it is a bit of an emotional roller coaster, and definitely not the most wonderful of experiences, even if it's not necessarily a negative experience. Another user named Amber asks, what are the scariest and most meaningful moments of transition? And so the most meaningful moment, I think, is similar to those ups from starting HRT, kind of that self-actualization of, I am now taking control over my life, taking control of my future, and to some extent I am in the matrix saying there is no spoon. All the rules of the system, the game, whatever, you realize that if you transition, you are breaking a lot of these rules. And, once you realize that these things don't actually exist or they don't apply to you, that's sort of a very powerful type of belief, where you realize I can change at least my place in the world, if not the world itself. And what are the scariest moments of transition, or the scariest parts? I think that is probably just the increased vulnerability. And I don't mean only in terms of, more likely being a target of sexual assault or anything like that. So much as I mean the fact that if I'm being my true authentic self now, there's no shield to protect me from, if people don't like who I am. Because in the past, if they didn't like that persona of, douchey frat bro, great, that's fine, because that's not who I really was. But if they don't like me now, I don't really care. But at the same time, you are a little bit more vulnerable being your authentic self than you are being somebody kind of fake. Heather asks about dealing with interviews, and so I'm not sure what she's specifically kind of trying to get at, but I think it probably has to do with disclosing, because you may be at various points throughout transition, and do you bring that up? How do you bring it up? Whatever. And I think that unless there's a really good prompt or opportunity for you to discuss it in the context of how that adds value to the organization, then it's something that you really don't want to bring up until after you get the job offer, because one, that's going to protect you a little bit more legally. So you can, if you feel like you've been discriminated against for being trans, you can say, well, I was given the offer, everything was fine, then I disclosed the status, and all of a sudden my offer disappeared and they gave that job to somebody else. That's something where you can prove that a little bit easier than you could if you just don't get hired because you don't fit the organizational culture. And granted, that makes some assumptions about your ability to pass, your paperwork being in order, and things like that, which may not be the case for everybody. In which case, unless you're being trans, directly kind of aligns with the company's either position on LGBT rights in general, which is something you should be able to figure out from the internet rather than asking in the interview, it's not necessarily something to bring up. Gabriella asks, if I had SRS in Thailand, who would I see and why? And I think there's basically two choices when you go to Thailand. It's either Dr. Supron or Suporn, however you pronounce his name, and Dr. Chetawat. And I think Supron is considered the more skilled or more selective of the two surgeons, just based off of his price point. And that's probably who I would go see, because I already have SRS, and so in this hypothetical situation, why not go with the one who is considered the best? Even though I'm not sure how much different his results are than Dr. Chetawat's on average. Wendy asks, now that you've had SRS, what's next? And, I think I'm still making these videos, so obviously I'm still interested in helping other people with their transitions, but I'm also, no longer spending a lot of energy on getting SRS myself or recovering from SRS, and now I get to focus on sort of other stuff that I want to do, whether that is my career or, my own projects, own entrepreneurial kind of ideas to pursue, whatever, that's what I'm going to focus on, just living my life. Similarly, Ryan asks, now that you're post-op, how does that change your hormones, your HRT? And that answer is, well, I obviously don't have to take an anti-androgen anymore, so no more spironolactone. The amount of estrogen that I take has been reduced. I was at 8 milligrams oral, now I'm at 6, which is still a pretty high dose, and it's considered, I guess, a very high dose for somebody who is post-op. But when we checked my levels, everything looked good, so it's what's right for my body chemistry. And I also don't have nearly as bad side effects as I did from hormones before, so I don't have to take some of the drugs I was taking to deal with those issues as well. Alex asks, do I have to dilate forever? And while I don't necessarily have to dilate with a dilator forever, I will need to keep my vagina from trying to heal itself shut, and the only way to do that is to basically stick something up there on a continual basis. Not as frequent or as long maybe as I had to do in the short post-op term, but it is something that I either have to have penetrative sex, so penis and vagina, or I have to be dilating, and maybe in some cases you even want to do both, depending on your partner's anatomy and things like that. Elizabeth asks, can you talk about how long it took to get your consultation with Dr. McGinn and how much time there was between that consult and SRS? And so in my sort of personal narrative, I actually lucked out and I was able to get a consult off the wait list because, unlike the average person, I have a much more flexibility in terms of, booking flights and things like that. So I was able to kind of easily jump on a plane and go see her, where not everybody maybe has that privilege. I think if I remember correctly, she was probably scheduling those consults anywhere from 3 to 6 months out, and then recommending SRS no sooner than 3 months after your consult, but more like 6 months, because you have a lot of pre-op work that you have to do, in addition to all of those sort of requirements to be eligible for surgery. You actually have to be in shape to have surgery, and so if you're not, then you need time to get in shape before surgery as well. And that can take, a variable amount of time for people. So that's why she tries to give, I think, a little bit more lead time. But, like, things happen, or you could uncover some condition, which, you could be perfectly healthy, but some test comes back with some sort of condition that you never realized was there. Joni asks a 3-part question. How much value do you attach to people who supported your transition early on? Were there people who didn't support it initially but came around? And if so, what did you do to change their minds? And I was pretty lucky in that I had one negative reaction from one person. And I don't know if they changed their mind. I don't care if they changed their mind, because they weren't somebody who was particularly close to me in the first place. So do I attach any more value to somebody who was a strong supporter early on in my transition versus somebody who came around later, or came to support me more strongly later? No. And, if I had somebody who was unsupportive, like, I wasn't, I guess my brother is an example of, he said, I don't understand, why you have to transition. My response was, well, do you really need to understand? And he said no, because it wasn't about me changing his mind or getting him to understand my perspective, because he's never going to be able to do that. So I don't feel like transition is something I have to convince other people about the legitimacy or whatever. Like, I'm not, I understand why you would want your parents or family to be supportive, but I'm not sure there's a lot you can do to make them change their minds. You kind of have to let them come around on their own, from what I've seen based on kind of other people's experiences. Robin mentions a website that I know exists out there that talks about people who have, post-transition regrets and then want to detransition. And typically these are people who had SRS and then come to later regret it. I think, detransition is probably a big enough subject on its own where you could make a series of videos about it. But to be brief, I think that people detransition more because of social pressure than because they come to the realization that transition wasn't for me. Especially if you go that far. Because why would you continue with hormones? Why would you start getting these surgeries if you didn't feel better about yourself? I think that there is some truth to the idea that, you have to be a certain way to get viewed legitimately as trans or whatever. But I think that's more historical and not as much the case anymore. And I would be very skeptical about why people put up these websites to talk about detransition. It sounds very similar to, oh, well, I used to be gay, but then I found God and I converted, and, I cast aside those sinful ways, or things like that. And that tends to be the message for a lot of detransitioners. But I think there are some people who might be trans who don't actually need to transition. And there's no right way to transition, which means that detransitioning isn't inherently wrong. But, it's not something that I would ever do personally, because I remember how miserable I was before transition, and I know how happy I am now. And so any perceived benefit of detransitioning would be vastly outweighed by the benefits that came with transition. And I think that's the case for everybody who is trans and needs to transition. Christine asks, what steps were needed prior to SRS? And I will actually cheat on this question and say that I made a series of videos where I outline all the logistics, the medical requirements, the WPA-TH requirements, things like that. And so I actually created a playlist for the 100-day SRS countdown where I talked at length about everything that I had to do. Rebecca asks how many cc's for my breast implants, and I haven't even scheduled my consult yet. I haven't thought about that. Probably thinking somewhere between a B and a C. I'm not quite sure, but definitely no bigger than that. Alexander asks if I will come to Los Angeles, and the answer is yes, I will come to LA, but I'm not going to come to LA specifically to see somebody who's a fan of my YouTube channel, unless they happen to offer me a pretty good incentive. And Joe asks if I date straight men, and the answer is yes, I do, but I do not date them exclusively. I also date bi men and women, as well as gay women, basically people who are interested in me. I'll date them if I'm likewise interested in them. And that is it for this Q&A, and I will see you guys with another Q&A here in probably a couple of weeks or months or whatever.